As you already know, I look at colonial and post-colonial literary representations of Cyprus in English and in translation, and I'm interested in how linguistic form is necessary in understanding the ways in which Cypriot writers compose the works in the ways in which they do, and also how we understand translation through acts of self-translation, but also the ways in which we can complicate our sense of mother tongue in terms of understanding quite our relationship with it, and whether one's relationship with one's mother tongue involves more of a translated sense of self through different linguistic forms than we might ordinarily assume. So for my talk today, I'm going to be focusing on two writers, and in particular two of their works. I'm looking at Kostas Montes and Tana Beybars. Montes was a Greek Cypriot writer and Beybars a Turkish Cypriot writer, and the two texts I'm looking at, Closed Doors for Montes and Plucked in a Far Off Land for Beybars, are both very similar works. They're both fictionalized life writing, examples of fictionalized life writing, and they contain very many generic, stylistic and thematic parallels. They're both informed by the genre of the Bildungsroman. They both are temporally fragmented. The structures of both include very short, punchy chapters, for instance, and thematically they're concerned with very similar issues regarding the context from which they emerge. They look at anti-colonialism, they look at nationalism, they look at language in very kind of interesting metatextual ways during the 1950s and 60s and perhaps a little bit earlier. The one major difference between the two is that Montes's work was composed in Standard Modern Greek and first published in Athens in 1964, whereas Beybars' work was published in English in the United Kingdom in 1970. So 64-70, emerging from the same sort of temporal juncture, but nonetheless composed in different linguistic forms and published in different places, both concerned with Cyprus. So something quite interesting here in terms of these two writers publishing their works from two different metropolitan spaces outside of the island, but nonetheless for these works that are so crucially engaged with this very specific locale. So the first thing I want to kind of emphasize is the fact that these two writers, despite these differences in language and despite the fact that the writers come from different ethno-linguistic groups from the island, are so interrelated in terms of the ways in which they have been composed. And what I think is interesting about that is the fact that it signals to the existence of a kind of pan-Cypriot literary movement from this period of time that I think demonstrates the fact that these texts cannot be wrested from the very specific geographic locale from which they have emerged. Often Cypriot writers are interpolated into much larger categories of literary production, be it Greek writing, Turkish writing, or British/English writing. For example, in 1955, Montes was bestowed the Award for Excellence in Letters and the Arts by the Republic of Cyprus. And in the introduction during the award ceremony, he was described, quote, not simply a great Cypriot poet, but the leading living Greek poet. I think it's quite a forceful interpolation of him into a wider category of writing outside of the island. He is Cypriot, but more than that, according to this particular interpretation of him, his work needs to be read in context of Greek writing. It cannot simply exist as simply an example of Cypriot literature. In contrast, however, when the text was first was first translated into English in 2004, the year after the 1974 border began to break down, began to open up, his translator, David Russell, throughout his introduction, repeatedly refers to the Cypriotness of the work and of the writer. He refers to him as a Cypriot, as Cyprus's greatest poet, and as a composer of, quote, Cypriot literature. I think something's changed here, depending on the time in which the author is being written about, depending on the language in which his works are being read in. Similar to this kind of problem, this interesting paradigm, is the fact that Tana Beybars, after having moved to the United Kingdom quite early on in his life, was insistent on not being interpolated into a larger category or canon of Turkish writing. In an interview in 1991, for instance, he asserts quite vehemently, quote, I am a British poet of Turkish Cypriot origin and not a Turkish poet. And I think what's important throughout all of this is to understand the ways in which language and the linguistic form in which one is writing dictates the ways in which a writer sees their literary affiliations and the ways in which the sort of the social habitus outside of those texts understand the ways in which these texts need to be read. So what do these two writers within their fictionalized life writing say about language? What do they have to? What do they kind of? How do they represent this dilemma of linguistic identity? To briefly offer some background for those unfamiliar, in 1960, when Cyprus gained independence, its official languages were elected as Greek and Turkish. This meant that the official language of administration for almost 100 years, English, was entirely marginalized from this governmental authority. So on the one hand, it is quite a symbolic rejection of English having any kind of official status in the newly formed Republic of Cyprus of 1960. But also I think it's important to stress that the official languages were standard modern Greek and standard modern Turkish, which is the case today. These standardized forms are not the same as the spoken vernaculars of the island, Cypriot Greek or Kypriaga, or Cypriot Turkish and Kıbrıslıca or Kıbrıs Türkçesi. These two languages, these two vernaculars, are often denigrated as having lesser cultural value. They're not treated. They're not standardized. They're not codified. They're not the languages of written literary production, the kind of genre that I'm looking at today. They're not the language of pedagogy, of academia, of policy. So how do Montes and Baybars deal with this complex linguistic background? On the one hand, English is a hegemonic language of the British Empire. On the other hand, Greek and Turkish, having been standardized in Athens and Ankara or Istanbul, have also been brought in from abroad. For me, this makes me think of the Latin, the very literal meaning, Latin meaning or etymology of translating, to bear across. These languages have been born across from outside of the island into the island. And although Standard Modern Greek and Standard Modern Turkish are often referred to as mother tongues, to what extent actually does speaking or writing in those languages involve a sense of translation, self-translation, that is comparable in certain ways, not entirely, with writing in English, with self-translating in English? To what extent is Montes translating his self, his lived experiences, by writing in Standard Modern Greek, the language of Greece, not the spoken language of Cyprus, as much as Tanner Baybars is when he writes in English, the language of the former British Empire. So Montes and Baybars, both very concerned with discussing English throughout their works. Montes, in his text, recounts the anti-colonial struggle by Eoga against the British Empire. He recounts many scenes of violence against British authority on the island as part of this, quote, game of divide and rule. But in addition to that, and I think more importantly, he says, quote, there was also a war against the English language, against English road signs. The war was to completely eliminate English from our lives. A statement that I think demonstrates quite polemically his decision to reject English as his literary language and to write in a language that he sees as having a more pre-colonial and post-colonial disposition. At moments throughout this Greek text, he intersects English words throughout, which are obviously extremely apparent, having the Latin cut into the Greek text. At one point he uses the word curfews, and he follows that with the parenthesis, I use the English word because it is weighed down in such pain without equivalent in Greek. He goes on then to detail the ways in which he explicitly wants to reject, quote, expressions from a foggy northern country, political spin with no relation to our lives. In many ways, he's expressing the ways in which a translation into English, a self-translation into English, is not possible. The lived experiences of Cypriots during this particular juncture cannot be contained within the hegemonic force of this dominant discourse. Baybars describes English in very many similar ways, and throughout his text he uses the idiom of cutting to represent the force of English on the island. His depictions of the cutting force of English go alongside his representation of the mid-60s, where intercommunal violence was increasing. He describes this as a period of, quote, the emergence of, quote, a dividing line within the island, which I think, with a lot of pathos, sadly foreshadows the actual dividing line of 1974. He discusses the duplicity that he feels within himself learning English and how he becomes a, quote, transmutated person, both as someone who eventually is forced to leave the island, but even before then as someone who is constantly speaking more than one language. In particular, he links this to the force of English within pedagogy. And he says that by reading English textbooks at school, by learning English as his second or third language after Köprüzlüce and Standard Turkish, he says, quote, English words were gradually cutting into my tongue. And he juxtaposes that with the image of a newly erected cinema on the island, where American heavies, with their ugly charm, were moving across the screen like a pair of scissors. This is a moment where colonial pedagogical reforms, as well as American consumer culture, are forcing English onto the island in ways that create a sense of disjuncture within oneself. But more importantly, he emphasises that it also creates a disjuncture between Cyprus's different linguistic communities, those who speak the varieties of Greek, the varieties of Turkish, but also Cypriot Arabic and Armenian. He states, for instance, that learning English was a new, wonderful experience, something quite exotic. But also, it was this, quote, because I had not seen a Greek textbook. I had only heard and spoken the few odd words. This is placed in juxtaposition with the lived experiences of his parents and people from their generation throughout the text, characters of their generation throughout their text. His father, for instance, speaks Köprüzlüce and Cypriot. His father was not taught English in school, but also, I think more importantly, and something I hope to go into, he wasn't taught the standardised forms of Greek and Turkish at school either. Baybars in his generation in schools, it has the competing forces of standard Turkish and English, forcing him to never experience the learning of the Greek language and creating a division between those two communities. I've sort of run out of time, and I wanted to go on into more detail looking at nationalism in both texts, because I think both writers refer to nationalism in very similar ways. They look at the force of these standardised languages on the island. So much so that Baybars wants to reject the use of standard modern Turkish as his literary language. And even though Montes writes in standard Greek, throughout the text he's very insistent on what he calls the creation of a Cypriot voice, some sort of creation of something Cypriot within the confines of a more dominant language. So for both these writers, English is shown as a foreign hegemonic language that cuts Cypriots through translation. But they also hint, and sadly I haven't gone into as much detail, but they also hint at the ways in which nationalism and the purification of standardised linguistic forms are also complicit in the division of Cypriots from each other, and complicit in the division of Cypriots from local vernaculars. None of the languages that Cypriots could choose to write in, be it English, Greek or Turkish, are unproblematic. However, English offers the advantage of a much wider transcultural, trans-border readership that I think, for the purposes of this weekend's conference, is necessary in allowing Cypriot writers to create works that can be read across the island by both Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. Okay, thank you.